Hi, everybody. This is Rick Rongans. This is a short lecture on, or short video on carrying capacity for SD 2610, Science for Sustainability. So for some of you, I've actually started this conversation in class. We've already kind of started this, but I wanted to put it all together in a single kind of presentation. As we go through this, I just want to say that, again, we would normally do this kind of dynamically. So I want to try to, or interactively. So I would normally give you time to kind of think through some of the questions I ask as we're going along. So try to put yourself in that situation. Imagine we're in the classroom, and when I ask a question, don't wait for somebody else to answer it. Think about it yourself. Really reflect on some of these questions to try to help you build your understanding of carrying capacity and its applications to kind of social ecological systems, right? So we've got 4 goals for this short presentation. The first one is to understand the concept of carrying capacity in ecology. And so this is introduced to us in Odum's writings from the ecological vignettes. And then the second thing we want to do is to understand its application to humans. And so this is kind of the focus of Odum writing, is to think about what does this mean for human systems. Our third objective is to explore Odum's notions of homeoresis, or pulsating states, and dynamic carrying capacity. So we want to think about carrying capacity as something that changes and is influenced by our own actions. Our last objective is to understand the concept of environmental resistance within natural systems, and then to consider the idea of socio-ecological resistance, to think about whether we have, whether there are some parallels that we can introduce. So what I'm going to do for this, I'm going to go through a few slides here to start, and then we're going to kind of whiteboard for a while after that, okay? So again, let's start with just this notion of carrying capacity. So carrying capacity can be defined as the number of people or other living organisms or crops that a region or an area, unit of land, can support without environmental degradation, right? So the carrying capacity then is dependent upon what's the organism that we're talking about. And also kind of this understanding about what we mean by environmental degradation without environmental degradation. Okay, so let's start with the kind of basic notion of how growth happens within natural systems. And we can think about the notion of growth without limits, no limitations, and that is exponential growth. It's also known as a J curve, and so it's shown in the graph below. And this is population growth kind of based on biotic potential for reproduction. So if I had a petri dish and I spread some bacteria in it, or put something that had bacteria in it, those bacteria would divide and multiply until, and they would demonstrate a pattern like this, this J curve, exponential growth, right? So again, this is a growth pattern under ideal conditions, but it's not really, doesn't represent real world conditions in a setting where there are limitations, right? So you're more likely to see this in a small system with very low densities. But if we think about larger systems, this doesn't happen, right? This isn't what we tend to see. We only see it at the kind of beginning of a growth period that we see it, right? So let's think a little bit about what prevents exponential growth in natural systems, right? So think about this for yourself for a second. Why would that petri dish eventually, the number of bacteria, stop producing? Or if I looked out my window right now and I saw a field, I could see, I could ask myself, how many rabbits could persist on that field, right? And there'll be limitations, right? So let's think about what it might be. It might be the amount of food that they have, and that amount of food would in turn be dependent upon the ability of the plants that the rabbits eat in order to grow. So how much sunlight, how much water, how much nutrients. Also depend on prey. Are there coyotes? Does my neighbor's cat attack the rabbits, et cetera, right? So for most systems, we can think of the first obvious limitation, or the prevention of exponential growth, is resource constraints, right? So that's our first thing. We run out of resources, or the kind of the flow of resources gets exceeded. The second thing, and we can think about this for a second, if we think about not bacteria, but yeast, right? So I like to bake bread. So when I bake bread, I add yeast. The yeast start to multiply as they're slowly, so they're taking the carbohydrates in the flour and they're converting it among other things, into CO2, right? So they're gonna create CO2. But they eventually, if I leave it too long, if I leave it rising too long, there'll be too much CO2 and actually kind of almost, there's too much waste in the system, right? So the other factor, and it'll stop rising, it'll fall, right? So we can think of both kind of factors that prevent exponential growth are lack of resources or inputs, and the second one is waste, accumulations of waste and inability to process that waste. I just wanted to introduce, I'm not going to introduce Justus von Liebig, but so I do want to introduce his notions, right? And so he was a German chemist who particularly studied agricultural production. And one of his unique contributions was that he was really one of the first people that identified that crops and plants grow based on their needs for specific nutrients, right? So identified that they need nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and that it wasn't just kind of good soil, it was specific nutrients that were needed. So this is really important to kind of understand what limited or what might promote growth. And so one of his, so if you think about these different factors that are needed for plant growth, and once you can identify them, he also realized that that plant growth was really dependent upon the most scarce resource, right? And this is what is referred to as the law of the minimum. Right? So if the plant is growing and there's not enough nitrogen, but lots of potassium and phosphorus and water and sunlight, if there's not enough nitrogen, it won't grow, right? If there's nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sunlight, but there's not water, it won't grow. If there's all those other pieces except for the sunlight, it won't grow. But if you add that one nutrient, if you add that limiting factor, the factor that's most holding it back, right? Then it'll grow. And it'll grow, or you'll have growth until another factor becomes the limiting factor, right? So if that makes sense, you can always add. But if you have a system that has plenty of nitrogen in it, adding more nitrogen doesn't actually create more growth. At some point in time, you get these diminishing returns. But this is important in understanding what might be driving the patterns we see around carrying capacity, that it's not an innate characteristic of the land, but maybe it's a function of a number of different specific pieces. All right, so we want to pause here, and we're going to stop sharing from here, and we're going to share instead. I'm going to pause this recording for a second. Okay, I'm back now. I got my share working here. So we're going to visualize carrying capacity, right? So I'm going to try to do this as we whiteboard it, right? So carrying capacity. Okay, so we often can visualize carrying capacity. What we want to do is we want to think about a population over time. And what does it do? So in order to try to visualize this maybe a little bit better, let's think about a specific place. And I'm gonna go to my go-to place in terms of places to visualize, right? So so you can imagine your own setting if you want to, like think about where you want to imagine, but this is part of Fork Branch Valley out where we have our farm. And so I want to think about carrying capacity in the context of this specific space. And so I can ask myself, again, we think about it for different organisms. I want to think about it for deer for this to start our context, right? So let's think about what's the population of deer? What's the carrying capacity of the population of deer here, right? And so if you think about carrying capacity, we can think about it as, go back to this. So we think about this as a type of a limit, right? And we can think of it as K. And that what happens is the population, in this case of deer, if we introduce a kind of a small breeding population of deer over time, we might start with a small number. That number would go up, and it goes through a period that almost looks like exponential growth because there's plenty of resources, there's not too many predators around, but then we start to realize you start to approach the carrying capacity, right? And the notion of carrying capacity in this context is that if you have a population that's below its carrying capacity for its land, it's likely to have a tendency to increase. If it's above its carrying capacity, it's likely to decrease. But let's think about it this way as kind of reaching this. And I want us to think for a second concretely about what it is that's driving or determining this pattern of growth, right? So let's think about this population, in this case, is a function of a number of different things, right? So let's imagine some deer out there. So they need fodder, they need browse, so they need food, right? So they need the plants out there. Those things, in turn, the plants that the deer are going to eat need sunlight, they need water, they need nitrogen, they need potassium. So they phosphorus, potassium. The population is also dependent upon predators. Predators, we'll go with that. All right. And we need a growing temperature, so we need enough heat so those things can grow. But in this case, it's really dependent upon the primary producers in this system, which are going to be the plants that create the browse for the deer, right? So if we think of this as our let's pause a second. Okay, so imagine that we introduce this population of deer, and we think about it, the fact that once they start to run low on food, what's primarily on food, or we have too many predators, we have this carrying capacity. But it's not so simple. And Odom kind of talks about this, that it's unlikely that systems kind of know exactly where that carrying capacity, or the populations know exactly where that carrying capacity is, and it stops just short of that. So let's think about what might be a little bit more realistic with this population. And so we introduce our deer, they follow this pattern, they get going, and they overshoot. Okay, they overshoot. Why do they overshoot? Because there's population momentum. There's enough deer, there's enough bucks, and what starts to happen? And we start to kind of visualize this. Actually, you can see this more in urban settings that have high deer populations. Is, well, they start grazing grazing down the pasture or the grasses. They might start eating even your rhododendrons. You can start to see the kind of damage that you'd expect. In a place like this, they might start to eat all of the oak seedlings that are coming in, and it might start to change. We might have fewer and fewer oaks. And why didn't that show up? Huh. I'm gonna pause. Okay, had a little glitch there, but so let's think back. So we got our population. This is our kind of idealized version of carrying capacity. That's how the deer see that they're starting to run low, but that's not what happens. And Odom talks about this. He talks about the fact that what populations normally go through is a process of overshoot, right? So if we introduce our deer population, they do is they actually go past the carrying capacity, right? And what starts to happen is, well, we might start to see there's areas that graze down to too much. You might start to see that some of the trees are getting grazed back harder than you would imagine. They might be eating all of the oak seedlings and actually changing the composition of the forest. The population might be so high that you get a higher mortality among the young, or even in a higher incidence of disease. The other thing that might happen is we might end up with more coyotes coming in, right? So more predators coming in. And so as a population tends to go through an overshoot, there's a set of pressures, less food, et cetera, that push it back down, right? And it can do a couple different things. In some cases, it might create a real crash, a real boom, or a real bust that's followed by an increase. Or it also might end up with a system that's more oscillating like this, right? Where you get slight increases in, you overshoot, you get too many predators, the forage starts to die back, and then the predators go down, so the population goes down, and then the predators go down, and so you end up with this kind of oscillating back and forth, right? And so this is Odum's kind of notion of homeoresis, that you don't have to have a boom and a bust, and in fact you could get this balance, but it's a dynamic balance that's occurring because of the different factors that are driving, the different limiting factors that are affecting population growth. Okay, so I want us to, let's see if it'll let me do this. Let me add another page. All right, so we're gonna add another page. And let's think a little bit more about this for, we'll add our picture back in. Nope, I don't want that one. I want, put our picture back in. Move it up to our corner here a little bit. Okay, now start this again. We're going to do carrying capacity. In humans, okay? And so let's start with our same notion of the same piece of land. We can think of time. We can think of population, right? So let's think about this across a valley, across a 100-acre area, whatever we want to think about this. And so humans have the same, we can think of the same carrying capacity K, and we might have the same initial, let's go with blue here, the same increase in population. But let's think about what happens for human populations as we start to overshoot, right? So what happens, right? A couple things might start to happen as we get, or let's think about the factors first here. So okay, so let me bring this back just a little bit here. Okay, let's continue this, right? So let's think about the same idealized version of a carrying capacity, right, for humans. And let's think about the same question about the population. So the population is a function of food, and the food is got our nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sun, water, okay? But food, so let's think about this across this area. So the amount of the carrying capacity, the number of people who could live off this kind of given unit of land depends in part upon about what kind of food we produce, right? So there's kinds of food that are, and how much of it we produce, right? So so we can think about, are we producing cattle? Are we producing our calories through through vegetables, through grains? So the more we have, the higher meat content within our diet means that we're going to actually need more area, and we'll need more nitrogen, more phosphorus, we just need more area in order to grow feed, in order to grow animals. The other thing that's going to be different too is we're not just, unlike deer, we have social consumption as well, right? So in addition to our food needs, we have housing, right? We have leisure. I'm sure deer have leisure too, but I think it looks probably a little bit different. And so we could think of these as different pieces. If we want a bigger house, then we need more forest in order to do it, right? And so, and the reason I say this is that K are for humans, for humans, K is dependent not just upon the land, but also on our patterns of consumption, right? So it's a function of our patterns of consumption. And we'll see this as we go later, but so it's what we eat, how much we consume, right? And so let's think for a second though too about what happens, a different thing that happens with humans, right? So Deer have limited ability to kind of go beyond the unit itself, this unit of land that we're thinking about. But humans have a little bit more ability to do this, right? So let's imagine humans doing the same thing. They start to approach, we start to approach, and we start to overshoot. And we're going to think a little bit about what overshoot looks like conceptually in a minute. But if we start to run out of, we're not producing enough on the land that we have, what do? Well, we've got a couple different limiting factors. Say water is our limiting factor. We might introduce irrigation, right? So we might get a pump, and that pump has embodied in it both its manufacture, the mining. There's a whole set of resources that went into creating that pump. And then maybe it's driven by gasoline or diesel or electric. So we're now getting energy that's brought in outside this area in order to enable us to kind of produce, to kind of get rid of our limitations on water. Okay, well, so say we get enough water now. So we've got, water's not our limiting factor. But what if it's nitrogen? What if nitrogen now is the limiting factor? We can't grow fast enough. What we're going to do is we're going to go to the store. We're going to buy some fertilizer, right? So that fertilizer, though, so we're going to try to work on that limiting factor. But buying that fertilizer, it also has embodied resources, right? So there's energy that went into basically kind of industrially or chemically sequestering that nitrogen from the air and turning it using pressure and heat and the Haber-Bosch process, which we'll talk about, to enable us to kind of overcome that limitation, right? But so we're basically borrowing resources from other land areas and in this case, often tapping into fossil fuels in order to do this. But we're exceeding the original carrying capacity because we're kind of cheating. We're borrowing resources from other places, right? What about if it's then phosphorus? Well, maybe we have to get lime and we apply the lime to the soil. And so we actually get to, we exceed our capacity again because we are using resources from other land areas, not just our own. And so that's the way that we're able to do this, right? And I want to just maybe one more way of trying to think about this. And so if we think about these different, our different kind of inputs down here, another way to think about those is as, if we think about like, how do we not deplete those, right? So let's think about each of these as like a container, all right? I'm gonna test my drawing skills here. And let's think of a couple different kind of containers or inputs into our system, right? And so for most of these, let's think about what, actually let's start with nitrogen. And let's assume that nitrogen, think of it as something that's orange, I don't know why. And we can think of this as like a big barrel of nitrogen that we have in our land, right? So but really what's happening is there's a constant slow input that allows us to have a certain kind of use level, right? So there's a process of decay of organic matter that's happening, which is releasing nitrogen into the system. It moves through the system and then we can take up that. There's also a fair amount of nitrogen fixation that might be going on. And so this is also kind of bringing, so leguminous plants are working with bacteria to fix nitrogen, and we can use this up. But if we wanted to, for instance, turn up this faucet, right? And get a faster flow of nitrogen so that it wasn't limiting this, one of two things would happen. Either we have to get more input, we have to get more inputs in, or eventually this is going to get drawn down, right? And we're going to run out of our nitrogen, if that makes, hopefully that makes some sense. The reason I think this, we think about this for each of these different inputs, right? So you can think in most natural systems, these different input or these different potential limiting factors are a product of kind of stocks and flows. The stock is how much is in our barrel. So how much nitrogen is kind of up there in our land, how much phosphorus, how many, what are the nutrients that are there, how much soil organic matter is there. And we can, and there's a natural process by which these are being produced slowly. And as long as we are using them at essentially the level at which they're being replaced, that's sustainable. If we start to draw down this resource and degrade the capacity of the land, then eventually we start to run into our limitation, right? Okay, then we already kind of talked about what do humans do if they run into these boundaries. Okay, I want to do one more way of kind of conceptually diagramming this, and instead of we'll do one more page here. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing. We're going to think about this as changing carrying capacity. Okay, so let's go back to our basic diagram. Got our S-shaped or our sigmoid curve kind of approaching this here, right? So we can think of this as a kind of our idealized version, right? But we know that's not really what's going to happen. We're going to have instead, let's think about what happens over time. Let's back it up a little bit, right? Okay, so let's go back to our population. Our population starts to grow and grow, right? And here's our carrying capacity, and we're going to have overshoot, right? So we have overshoot, and think about this. This is where those barrels start to get depleted, right? Where we're now drawing down instead of kind of just taking out what's coming in, we're now taking out more. We're drawing down those resources, those barrels. Our soil organic matter is getting washed down. Our nitrogen is getting depleted. The phosphorus is getting depleted. Maybe even the biodiversity of our system is getting depleted. And once that starts to happen, the system's fine with it for a little while, but as it starts to decline, then actually this starts to go down. Our carrying capacity goes down. So we're actually adding, once that, for instance, once that soil organic matter has been moved down the hill, once those resources are gone, it's incredibly hard to push them back up. You've actually reduced the carrying capacity of the land, right? And so I just want us to think of this notion of changing carrying capacity, so that even if we then manage to kind of bring things back, we're going to have it at a lower level than we would have otherwise, right? So this is kind of an example of environmental degradation, reducing carrying capacity. Okay. The other thing, I'm going to stop there with this share. We're just going to go back to our slides for a minute here. Okay, and so we're going to back to our slides. Okay, so again, we talked about this, what prevents this, and we have justice, and we did our visualizing. Okay, so a couple of other things, and this is again from Odom. It's not in the readings that you had from the vignettes, but it's from a later notion. If we think about, because for humans, well, for any population, but in particularly for humans, the sustainable load or the kind of the carrying capacity is dependent not just on the number of people, but also on the level of consumption. And we can think of this as the notion of cultural carrying capacity. When we mean cultural carrying capacity, it's the carrying capacity based on our cultural habits, right? So do we have a diet that is that's meat-based, or is it meat-based protein versus plant-based proteins? What's the level of other consumption? How big are our houses? How many cars do we have? All these things are parts of what our load is, what our per capita use is. And in this diagram, that is, you can think of this carrying capacity as kind of the flow of that's coming out of the resources, right? So this is like a pipe in a way. And we can think of we can either have a high number of users with a low per capita use, or we could have a low number of users with a high use, or we could have a moderate level. but we can't have a high level of users and a high level of per capita use, right? So this is the notion of cultural carrying capacity, that our choices affect our carrying capacity. And humans are unique in the sense that we have an ability to vary our cultural carrying capacity more than most organisms do, right? So deer can probably eat a lot more, they can eat different things, and certainly there's some ability to change this, but humans, because of their kind of social and technological relationships, we have an ability to really have a much higher level of cultural consumption and a much lower carrying capacity, right? So we're unique in this sense. This is also, again, one of the graphs from ecological vignettes. What do we learn about ecology for growth? It's assertion that we can have this boom or bust, but what we really want to do is have this kind of notion of pulsing systems right around the limits. We don't want to have to do boom and bust that depletes. We'd much rather keep at this level that can sustainably be maintained without resource degradation. That's what we should be shooting for, that kind of level. Part of the reason of thinking about these processes is important to think of there's no equilibrium, and there's in systems. Instead, what there are is dynamic checks and balances, right? So this is kind of goes back to Odum's notion of homeoresis, but there is no balance of nature. This is a dynamic. There's a drama. There's a kind of that's being played out between the resources, the population, predators, and other factors, right? So there's no single balance, but it's this dynamic process that we want to be understanding. Okay. I also want to introduce the notion of environmental resistance, right? So these are the factors that provide negative feedback that limits growth. These are the factors where the system, the ecological system, pushes back. And we can think of examples of this. We've already talked about a few. Predation is one, if we go back to the notion of deer, right? So the coyote population goes up. Disease is a form of environmental resistance. The population gets too high, the individual deer become a little bit weaker, and they become more susceptible to disease, or just and so these are kind of examples. So these include limits on food, water, habitat, density dependent interactions like predation, competition, and disease, right? And so these are factors that, again, that push. If we have overshoot, these are factors that push the population levels back to the carrying capacity, right? And this is what creates this kind of pulsing around the carrying capacity, and it's what creates homeoresis. And so this is another way to kind of think about it, is that in this early phases of growth, it's the biotic potential of reproduction, just the ability of organisms to reproduce, is driving essentially exponential growth. But that as you approach carrying capacity, we get these forms of environmental resistance that push back. Okay, as we think about this, so I want you to think, though, for humans, we've used technology, kind of power and economics, to be able to kind of avoid some of this resistance. We find ways to kind of get around it. In a lot of ways, we do it we use our political and economic and social power to get resources from others, so that we're not constrained by our own land's carrying capacity, because we're essentially acquiring resources from elsewhere, or we're utilizing energy from fossil fuel sources that are essentially getting around this, right? So if we've increased our ability to resist this resistance, right, to either push back or avoid this resistance, that's a problem, because it contributes to our overshooting, right? I would encourage us to think a little bit about it. Do we need just the environment to provide that resistance, or can we think about notions of socio-ecological resistance, right? So where we provide our own resistance, when we realize, hey, we're exceeding our capacity in some way, can we provide our own kind of social, political, or economic pushback, so that we say we need to push back, not to keep exceeding these limits. So I want us to think about, should we be playing a more cognitive role in providing resistance to overshoot, right? And in a sense, that's what this class is about. This is what you're thinking about how do we work, how do we organize in a way that we do what environmental resistance is supposed to do, which is to push the population levels back towards their carrying capacity. So how do we provide socio-ecological resistance? Okay, and from this, we can think of this notion of dynamic carrying capacity, right? That K, our carrying capacity, depends on changing environmental conditions and changing ecological footprints of individuals in society. So those are two really important things. That carrying capacity depends on the environmental conditions and our choices around our ecological footprint, right? Factors that improve or protect the ability of natural systems to support human life increase carrying capacity. So when I showed you the diagram of it declining over time, equally, we can think about ways of raising carrying capacity by investing in regenerative agriculture, by recovering areas that have been degraded. Those are things by protecting biodiversity within an area. All of those things increase carrying capacity rather than decrease it. Similar factors that degrade the ability of natural systems to support human life decrease carrying capacity, right? So we have choices both around where K is, where that line is, and we also have choices about how full we turn on those faucets. How much of those resources do we deplete? What happens to our barrels full of resources? And so those are both choices that we're making. What do we consume and what do we do in terms of protecting or degrading our environment? Okay, and I think we're gonna stop there. All right, thanks, appreciate you listening.